From elementals to UFOs, from tales of Bigfoot, dogmen, and the vast sundries of other cryptids and unexplained phenomena that have been a part of our folklore and culture since the beginning of time, we are all submersed into a mutual, subconscious awareness that there has always been more than what is normally perceived by our five senses of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Bigfoot and other cryptids have a strange habit of showing up near UFO sightings, and those who encounter either of these phenomena often discover that they have newfound psychic abilities or other abilities that seem straight out of an Avengers comic book series. Could there be a common cause that explains all paranormal events? I hardly think so. We live in a multiverse that sits on the fringe of several others, and they ripple out through all of infinity. Today we're going to explore the perception of perceptions and delve deeper into some of these strange phenomena that have been a part of our experience since the beginning of time. Welcome back to Into the Veil. I'm your host, Rachel. If you would, please take a moment to subscribe, ring the notification bell. That way you can be updated when we post new information.
Well, that makes me curious just how many people that have had encounters have came away with a feeling of a heightened sixth sense, or something that seems a little bit more out of the norm afterward, like to call it their spidey senses are on full alert, or
picking up on intuitive messages maybe. I think it can be really confusing sometimes when we try to rationalize a lot of the strange things against the ideas of what we're taught as being normal or real in the world that we live in on a daily basis. It's not something we're taught in school.
I think just by coming in contact with that higher vibrational rate, it awakens something within certain people and kind of sparks it back into a working, functional ability.
Right, and we've talked about DNA and how it's sparked with light. Light's information. So I think that there's something to that vibrationally, that it does help spark our DNA and reopen some of the facets of our mind, our energetic field, to perceive things that we couldn't perceive before.
One you had talked about before were the different layers of dimensions, and trying to break that down into a simplified explanation of how many did you say there were?
Well, it's funny because what came through were 23 solid, workable dimensions when channeling that information. Anku had relayed that they had easy access to a 13. Man had easy access to 9. But that still leaves 1. And my question is that the one between those? Or is that the top one that is where we would perceive the Godhead as sitting, the all that is? And do we really have access to that until we're in, what would you call it, the highest form of who we are?
It seems like it falls in line if you look at the imagery of something like the Tree of Life type imagery. And you've got 12 above, 9 below, and we're rooted in the third dimension in the center. It could be something very similar or identical to that.
And when you take the third dimension, even at that, what we often forget is that it actually consists of the first, the second, and the third. And even at that, there are layers within layers. You have the lowest level of the third, the middle, and the highest level of the third that borders the fourth. So when we're talking about dimension, we're actually talking about density and how elevated we are in that part that we are actively working with.
That kind of goes in line with the perceptions as well, because if we're standing at one point looking and then shift ourselves slightly, we're going to view it from an entirely different angle. So that changes or alters
based on
the view or the perception of the reality based on the angle from which we view it.
The other thing that's important to remember is, say in our sleep state, we have easy access to the higher dimensions, but by the time we are coming back into, say, our physical body right before waking, it's actually coming down into what we would call the fourth dimension, and it's filtered from that, some of those higher dimensions, into a version that we can assimilate or that we can understand. So perception doesn't just happen in our waking state, it's even happening in our sleeping state. Do take note that we are all subjected to various methods of indoctrination and social programming. The larger powers that be have been trying to mold our perceptions to fit their views and agendas for quite a long time. A lot of the older bloodlines, if you will, some of the original families have held this information, have utilized these keys, and have made it a prerogative to keep it from all of us indentured servants. But fortunately, there are still a number of us who are intelligent and realize when we're being played for the fool, and we realize that we're being coerced into a more herd mentality that only works to benefit the herd masters. But even with those that are aware or becoming aware, we are all guilty at some level of looking at things from a perspective of what conforms to being comfortable in the cultural environment that we're raised in.
Well, we've all been guilty at different times of having the same disease, trying to keep one foot in the pasture while the other one dangles over the outside of the fence. We're ready to jump back to the safety of the herd if anything uncomfortable jumps out or comes along. Subconsciously, we cling to the dogmas of the organized education, politics, and religions, the very same herd masters that would keep you submissive to their oppressed mechanical monstrosity, feeding you to the machine like coal to a bellowing furnace.
We all stand on the precipice of free will and free thinking, still internally judging what we view from the program structures that society has imprinted on us. For instance, ancient alien theorists will look at the Bible and they'll chalk up every bizarre event to alien contact, while religious scholars may look at contemporary alien encounters as manifestations of demons.
And someone with an angst toward the political structure, they're going to view everything as a type of a conspiracy.
Exactly. So everything's subjective to the vantage point from which we view it. I say it's time to expand the playing field and move beyond the claustrophobic restraints of business as usual. Everyone has been the indentured servant to the corporation that would gleefully use us as cannon fodder. And it goes far beyond the old cliche of thinking outside of the box.
I think it's time to burn the box.
Good idea. So you were correct earlier. There's never only one set answer, because there's never only one set perspective. If you shift your position ever so slightly, you'll see a whole new picture unfold. And that's only using one person, one dimension, one level of mental capability. The possible angles of perception are pretty much endless.
Then multiply that by the number of people on the planet, and what is the infinite potential of all of these perspectives? It's beyond calculation.
Exactly. And how many times have, say there's been an incident and the law has interviewed all these witnesses, and each one has just a little different perception of what happened or what they saw, and very seldom are two identical. That doesn't mean that any of them are truly incorrect. Based on what they saw, that's their truth. That's what they've, picked up on. That's what they perceived.
They're giving information from the vantage point that they saw it.
Mm-hmm. And a good example of this is a much bigger story, a much bigger and more famous paranormal experience, which is the Mothman incident of 1966. What was it, 13 months? Point Pleasant, West Virginia was plagued with sightings of a bizarre winged humanoid accompanied by mysterious lights in the sky. And they had animal mutilations and other accounts of bizarre paranormal activity that journalist John Keel famously documented during this period of time. And this was in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, which was later made into a film. So witnesses were all varied about the size, the color, physical attributes, unusual feelings attached to their sightings, except for the common theme of it appearing as a humanoid with bat-like wings, large glowing eyes, and giving off an intense sense of dread.
Well, those types of events were not new to Keel. You know, he wrote about window areas, specific locations on our planet where paranormal events were far more likely and even expected to occur. And we all know that these types of places now do in fact exist. We refer to them as portals and stargates, vortex doorways, and the list goes on.
That's right. And for experiencers and believers of the paranormal, the greatest frustration often lies in the lack of abundant physical evidence. So it's important to remember that 3D perception is not necessarily a 3D universe. We might find a few landing marks here, a few footprints or other evidence there, occasional photographs or video clips, but it never seems to be enough to convince the skeptics.
Well, one thing to bear in mind, a lack of measurable evidence does not mean a lack of existence.
That's right. And after decades of researching these cases, Keel developed an elegant hypothesis which explains the troublesome disparity between excessive testimony and scarce physical evidence. It's always been an issue. In his book, The Eighth Tower, which was written at the same time as the Mothman Prophecies, he proposed sort of a unified theory to explain all paranormal events. And this is that the entities were able to shift up and down the electromagnetic spectrum, appearing and disappearing as they please. He called this the superspectrum, and he referred to the beings inhabiting this as ultra-terrestrials.
Well, it sounds extremely like the song we've been singing this entire past year.
And it definitely makes sense of a lot of the information we feel like we've received in our own paranormal investigations, especially out there in the woods and dealing with the elementals and Sasquatch. And it's fascinating because it could explain a variety of the electromagnetic effects that are often associated with paranormal events. Help me think.
Cars will stall out. Sometimes power outages will occur. Radios and telephones go crazy. All of your battery operated things like flashlights and cameras, they either flatline or
just won't work.
Mm-hmm.
And clocks and watches have sometimes been known to just stop in the presence of this type of activity. So I think it's important to realize there are 4 forces of energy that we're consistently working with all of the time. Light, gravity, electromagnetic, and nuclear, which is our sun's power. And we would not have the effects of our sun if it weren't for this nuclear energy that it produces, which also creates a natural radiation that we have to have. The superspectrum is said to be where gravity and light meet the electromagnetic energies. So it creates its own band, if you will. And I believe that Keel was onto something because I think any variety of energy based on its construct, the higher vibrational energies, we may never actually physically see because they don't actually have a physical body. They are more of a form of consciousness or more of a form of light. So they operate out of a light body. But I do believe that some of what we consider ETs, or, currently have considered to be ETs, may operate out of a totally different construct. It may be more nuclear if it is, residing in that radiation or residing in that type of frequency.
Well, where these bands meet, it creates an overlap and creates corridors. Call them a travel corridor. Call them a transition corridor. A lot of times I think when we see these UFOs or some of the bizarre lights in the sky, what you're catching is an overlapping of dimensions.
Right.
And something that is in another dimension overlapping into our visual field for just that amount of time.
And if these effects of the energy bands create windows, if you take, say, the radiation factor or the nuclear factor of the sun's light, and you combine it with electromagnetic or certain gravitational, because of the minerals that are in the earth, certain gravitational elements where they're heavier, it could create that window where that overlap can happen. And I don't believe that it's at all impossible for us to be in a 3D environment and be able to see into the 4 and 5D easily.
If you're in the right location at the right time, the greatest skeptic can become the greatest experiencer.
And a vortex, when they've studied those, they've shown that it is where there's actually a wave that passes the physical plane. So it creates an angle, if you will, against from one dimension to another. And it's just in the geometrics of that it creates those doors and windows.
One of the things I had talked about and touched on in a video I had posted on my channel was the ability of dogs and cats, even children, to have this natural sense, a sixth sense, about when these things are occurring. Realistically, they haven't been subjected to the thought training that we as adults now have gone through. They take everything at face value. They don't know to believe that it's not real.
Right. And not only are they hearing it, but oftentimes they're seeing it because they're not judging it. And judgment is basically a measure. It's how we measure our reality.
Once you judge something, you have given a final determination. Subconsciously, you've told yourself that there can be nothing else. I have judged it, and that's the way that it is. It doesn't matter if you have an experience down the road. Internally and subconsciously, you're still going to deny it.
Right.
Because you've judged it.
And it creates its own expectation and its own reality by process of thought. And I think that's part of why once upon a time people readily saw elementals or spirits, because they had not been programmed. It was the opposite. They were programmed to believe that they existed. And I believe that it kept their eyes open. And then when certain indoctrinations came in to say that these things were wrong or evil, or that they were going to be punished if they were teaching this, little by little, it kind of fell from the mind of man, the perception of man, to where now it's almost like a foreign language to mention them. Another thing to realize, I believe, is that our sensory organs are constantly capturing a lot more information than what we can typically process. And the overflow of that information then would come to us as maybe abstract feelings or images, emotions. And one of the most critical functions of the brain's sensory response is filtering through information that it deems unnecessary for immediate survival. That was part of our evolution. That's part of our experience being in the 3D world. Pattern recognition plays a huge role in this process.
Now, if our eyes see something, our mind automatically tries to put it into a pattern that we can recognize from past experience. Is it dangerous? Is it edible? Is it neutral?
Right. You think you see something that looks like a tree, your brain acknowledges that the general shape is that of a tree, and it quickly creates the idea of a tree. But what happens when you observe something that doesn't fit a recognized pattern?
Your brain doesn't process it.
So we dismiss it. And without expecting something, we're unlikely to pay attention to it or even notice when it happens. So, consistent subliminal social programming, the ability to deny what's right in front of you. This could explain the common motif that when you start to focus and study this phenomena, they begin to reflect back because your awareness is lit up, it's on fire.
I know that to be a fact. What you focus on puts you in the same vibrational rate as that object or that entity or that creature, and it becomes easier and clearer to see, to interact, to hear, to feel.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then what was it in the 1960s? Gustav Davidson was a writer, and he was compiling a massive book of historical accounts called the Dictionary of Angels. And he had never had a paranormal experience in his life. But suddenly,
during the writing of that book, he
literally said he was bedeviled by angels.
Everywhere he looked, they would appear and communicate.
So it's all in perception, and it's all in our awareness. And I think that this is why we have become also more aware, perhaps, of, what we consider to be ETs. They may be ultra-dimensional instead of extraterrestrial. And you consider the ease of traveling dimensions through wormholes and things like this versus millions and millions and millions of light years to other, potentially galaxies, systems. It makes a lot more sense to me that as the veil has thinned and as these doors have opened and as people have become more aware, that now we're seeing more and more and more, no different than Gustav in his encounter with angels. It's in the awareness factor that we begin to perceive them. So bottom line is that whether we believe it or not, we are constantly surrounded by ultra-terrestrials, cryptids, elementals, energies of every shape, form, size, color, name it. And our focused attention is all that is necessary to perceive them. Of course, there's always the possibility that all of these paranormal entities throughout history could be our imagination. I guess it's possible for everybody to imagine the same thing. But more than likely, we are all living on a densely populated, multidimensional planet alongside beings who have interacted with us for centuries. Maybe they're from the past, maybe they're from the future. These are all things to explore. But we do know that they leave a little tiny trace within our own narrow perception of reality.
Well, the thought I would like to leave everyone with before you close tonight: how do you know we're not already living in an alternate reality? If you're over 40 years old, you can testify that this is not the world you grew up in.
Absolutely. Which opens up a whole new door to things like the Mandela effect and other things where we have to wonder. But I thank you for joining us. Food for thought for the night. I hope you'll come back and see us again. This is Rachel, my husband Ken. Have a good night.